Hello people. A couple months back I took a trip to the local recycling center to drop off some older unused printers, and as I was dropping them off an older gentleman was unloading some older PCs from the back of his SUV. I casually took a peek to see if any one of them had a better than a Pentium 4 sticker on it, and I noticed there was an old Dell with a Pentium D sticker on the case, which is, not that great. Anyway, I approached him and asked him if I could take it off his hands. He kind of gave me an odd look, but then said sure, and then also offered up a monitor. Jackpot, right? Or was it? The PC was a Dell Optiplex 320 in a mid-tower form factor. When I got the PC home, I opened it up to find the memory and the hard drive gone. The PSU also smelled like cigarette smoke really bad, so I removed that as quickly as I could. So I needed a PSU, a hard drive, and some memory to get this pile booted. I contacted a friend to see if he had any DDR2 memory laying around, and luckily enough, he had quite a few sticks. So I had an older Cooler Master 500 watt PSU laying around unused, and I had a laptop hard drive that wasn't in use. So I did put the laptop hard drive in the case, but I later swapped it out for an SSD because I could not deal with the slowness. I did a quick boot to see if it passed post, and it did. So I decided to take the Dell apart and give it a good cleaning, as the cigarette smoke was stinking up the joint. I cleaned up the heatsink and fan and removed the motherboard to clean underneath it. Alright, so before we go any further, let's jump into the objective of reviving this old Dell. What I really wanted to do is see if I can make a free/cheap gaming PC that could play newer free-to-play or eSport titles decently. It's a totally original concept and it's never been done before, right? Right, guys? Alright, well, moving on. I had all the replacement parts lined up for this PC. And what about a video card, though? Couldn't use the onboard ATI graphics as they're terrible. So I looked at the case and I realized that we have some problems here. First problem is that this is a BTX motherboard and the layout is left side right compared to ATX. And the big issue with the video card is that it can only be a single slot card or just a very short dual slot card, as the heatsink and fan shroud gets in the way. The second issue was the PCIe slot only pumps out 25 watts, so any gaming GPU that uses PCIe slot power only won't work. I thought about grabbing a GT 1030, but they do use up to 35 watts, and so I figured it might throttle, it might power limit, but I'm glad I didn't get one, and you'll see why later. As it turns out, the only card options I had on hand was a Radeon 5450 or an NVIDIA 8800 GT. And since all the games I planned on testing were DX10 and below, the 8800 GT became the clear choice. It was safe from that 25 watt PCIe slot limitation, as most of the power comes from the 6-pin PEG connector. The memory ended up becoming an issue as well. It seems this motherboard does not like 4GB of memory. The PC would blue screen of death every time when using 4GB of memory, or even 3GB of memory, with 2 sticks. I tried multiple sticks in multiple configurations, 533 MHz and 667, and I ended up sticking with a single stick of 2GB 667 MHz. Even if I was to occupy both slots on the motherboard, it would still only register single channel memory. The 2GB limitation stinks, but a lot of the games that I'll be testing today list 2GB as the minimum, so therefore they are possible to play. On a bright note, being the geek/tech hoarder that I am, I did have a Core 2 Duo E6600 on hand. And the Dell came with a Pentium D 925, which is a 3 GHz dual core, but the 2.4 GHz E6600 is better in every way. It's basically the legendary Q6600 Core 2 Quad cut right in half. Alright, well, now that everything is installed and put together, I went ahead and loaded up a trial version of Windows 10, downloaded all the drivers, and downloaded CPU-Z to do a quick bench comparison on the CPUs. So I put both CPUs in, different time frames, and the Pentium D scored 94.9 in the single-thread test, and 190.5 in the multi-thread test. The E6600 did 145.3 in single-threaded, and it did 294.2 in the multi-thread. While the Core 2 Duo was an improvement, its score seemed kind of low still. So I clicked back to the CPU tab and noticed the CPU was only running at 1.8 GHz, not the 2.4 I was promised. I also noticed the FSB was sitting at 800 MHz, while this Core 2 Quad has an FSB of 1066. After doing a bit of research, I realized that this motherboard only supports up to 800 MHz frontside bus, and nothing more. So I'll have to kind of work with what I got. Or do I? There is a cool utility called setFSB that allows me to overclock the FSB beyond what OEM systems are limited to. Sadly, I was only able to raise the FSB to 890, which gave us a 2 GHz core clock, but anything beyond that was strictly a hard lock. Oddly enough, running Cinebench again, I was greeted with the same scores pretty much, so I'm not sure if really anything happened. And it wasn't really worth the potential instability, so I went back down to 1.8 GHz regardless. Well, with the E6600 installed, I did fire up Cinebench R15 and scored 75 CB, which is terrible. Definitely being held back by the FSB limitation and the slow single-channel memory. I also mentioned that I swapped out the hard drive for an SSD, just a basic 240GB SanDisk model, and here are the Crystal Disk Mark results. We're dealing with SATA 2 here, so speeds aren't that great, but it was still a notable improvement over the slow 5400 RPM laptop drive that came out of it. There wasn't any option for AHCI in the BIOS, just in case you're wondering. Alright, enough jibba jabba, let's get into some game testing. Okay, well the first game we fired up was Rocket League, and at 1080p with everything set to the lowest, lo and behold, the performance was terrible. Believe it or not, the 8800 GT can play this game well at 1080p low settings in most capable systems, but what we have here is a classic case of CPU bottleneck. Check out that CPU usage, as well as the GPU usage. Ouch. Frame times were a disaster as well, and wasn't really much we could do to help alleviate that load on the CPU. Unplayable. Next game up is Paladins, and to no one's surprise, the story was much the same. The game was running at 1080p low settings. CPU usage wasn't pegged at 100% the whole time, but close enough. GPU usage was really bad, indicating there was a bottleneck, of course. Frame rates were even worse than Rocket League, unplayable. So before moving on to the next game, I wanted to make sure the GPU was being fed enough, and it was capable of hitting its full stride. We got that PCI slot limitation, so I wanted to make sure. So to do this, I fired up the power virus known as Furmark, and loaded up the 8800 GT. I noticed the GPU was seeing full utilization and running fine. Well, on the verge of blowing up, but running fine. I also swapped out the CPUs to make sure everything was copacetic on the CPU side of things. Everything checked out. With some brief testing with the Pentium D and the Core 2 Duo, the Pentium D was definitely slower. Alright, well let's get back to the slowness. The next game up is Path of Exile. And at 1080p low settings, again, we saw a huge bottleneck. CPU usage was maxed out and GPU usage was low as well. Frame rates were pretty crap, as well as frame times. Somebody might call this playable, but not me. Unplayable. Okay, well the last game we tested was Csgo, and at 1080p low settings, surprisingly enough, we ran into the same issue. While CPU usage wasn't fully maxed out all the time, GPU usage only hovered in the high 30s most of the time. It's pretty sad when your second generation compute stick can pull off better frame rates than this Dell tower. At this point, I pretty much just threw in the towel. I could drag this video out by showing you more of the slowness, but I don't want to bore you any longer. There could be a bright side though. If you do like really old games that work well on single core or really slow dual cores like this one, then gaming would still be possible. I didn't test any of them, as I was going to remove the SSD and throw the slow laptop drive back in. Maybe fire up a flavor of Linux, or maybe turn it into a pfSense router, maybe turn it into a FreeNAS system, or just take it out back and give it the Office Space treatment. Anyways, I failed the objective and wasted a bunch of time, but hey, I did learn some things about the Dell OptiPlex 320, and if I ever had an opportunity to get a free one again, I'd probably pass. Anyways, people, I appreciate you checking out the video, and subscribe if you like these kind of videos. I got a lot of GPU videos coming up, so stay tuned for that. F2F out.